Welcome everyone to our webinar, Understanding Reporting Obligations to the IRB. We're excited to be discussing this topic with you today. I'm Ari Burgess, Quorum's Director of Client Relations and Marketing. On that note, if you'd like to stay informed on Quorum initiatives such as our webinars, be sure to sign up for our mailing list. You can find the list by going to our website, www.quorumreview.com, and clicking on News and Events. The mail list sign up is in the upper right-hand corner. This will ensure that you'll receive the latest e-news updates from Quorum, including Quorum's responses to FDA guidance, trends in clinical trial review, and our quarterly e-news publication, the Quorum Forum. Immediately following this webinar, we invite you to participate in a brief survey that will help us understand how beneficial you found this webinar and what types of topics interest you. And now I'd like to take a few moments before we get started to talk briefly about Quorum Review. Quorum Review is fully accredited with the Association for Accreditation of Human Research Protection Programs, or AHRP, through 2014. Quorum is compliant with both FDA and OHRP requirements. We have 6 in-house licensed attorneys that provide both in-house regulatory guidance and can frequently be found speaking at industry events providing thought leadership. Quorum has boards that are appropriately comprised to review studies in the United States, Canada, and now even beyond North America. Currently, Quorum Review is one of the largest central IRBs with over 180 employees, and of those that are of equivalent size, we are the only IRB that remains independent of venture capital ownership. Quorum is proud of the number of employees that hold CIP certifications, the Certified IRB Professional. Currently, 60% of our affiliated IRB members, 40% of our regulatory staff, and 20% of our study manager and support positions hold this CIP certification. Quorum's turnaround times are among the best in the industry. Currently, Quorum holds 15 board meetings each week. We have a meeting every day dedicated to the review of new protocols and 2 board meetings each week where we review North American studies. We have 1 meeting each week that has a depth in oncology expertise if you prefer your oncology studies be reviewed there. Additionally, we have staff of reviewers who are continually reviewing expeditable items during business hours. The number of meetings we offer enables us to have 24-hour turnaround of site documents from the receipt of a completed submission to posting approval documents on the portal, 36-hour review cycle for amendments, and same-day site changes. To streamline site submissions, Quorum offers one-time submittal of CV and audit information. This prevents redundant submissions. Among Quorum's founding principles was the customer experience. To support that experience today, we have staff available from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and each study with Quorum, regardless of size, will receive its own study manager. Again, I'll put a little plug in here for our legal team because I think it's worth mentioning that many central IRBs utilize outside counsel, and the fact that Quorum doesn't utilize outside counsel for our regulatory team means many things. We have a regulatory attorney at every board meeting to help navigate the complex laws and regulations. Attorneys help with our consent form development, and our attorneys help answer complex questions regarding study and consent form design. Finally, it's because of Quorum's investment in our regulatory staff that we are able to put on these free webinars that help the research community at large. Additionally, Quorum offers a secure portal where you can find all of your approval documents. You can also find many different kinds of status reports here so you can quickly assess whether your study or site where your study or site is in our process, as well as our Smart Form Site Information Questionnaire. Quorum's aware that there are special needs for Phase 1 and expeditable research, or research that qualifies for expeditable review. We have special teams and processes for these kinds of studies. We work with hospitals and institutions and are able to support their unique needs. To date, we have signed working agreements with over 850 institutions, and that number does not count the number of institutions that work with us but don't require a signed agreement. Additionally, Quorum has a staff of institution specialists whose primary function it is to assist universities and hospitals through the process of utilizing a central IRB when appropriate. This model has been very successful at getting a larger percentage of overall study sites utilizing a central IRB. We are aware that quality is supremely important for our customers, and we perform a 100% quality check on all documents. Finally, we want to make everyone aware of Quorum's commitment to efficiency. Quorum employs a number of black belts and other Six Sigma qualified personnel whose sole job is to continuously evaluate our processes and eliminate steps that don't add value, giving our customers a less complicated process with less steps and less opportunity for error. And now I'd like to introduce today's expert presenter, Mitchell Parrish. Mitchell joined Quorum Review IRB in January of 2010 as a regulatory attorney. Prior to Quorum, Mr. Parrish worked as a regulatory counsel for Western IRB and as regulatory advisor to the National Cancer Institute. Mr. Parrish earned his Juris Doctor from the University of Oregon School of Law and is a member of the Washington State Bar, the Association of Corporate Counsel, Public Responsibility in Medicine Research, and the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society. Additionally, Mr. Parrish has his Regulatory Affairs certification and is a certified IRB professional. And now I will transition over to Mitchell.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Ari. Appreciate it. Now, good morning or good afternoon to everyone out there. Definitely excited to be discussing this topic today, and again, that is understanding reporting obligations to the IRB. How I've organized this presentation today is in the following way. First, I'm going to talk very briefly about the role of the IRB. Why does the IRB even have to receive this certain information? Also, what are some problems that currently exist with reporting information to the IRB? Then I'm going to cover very briefly the regulatory landscape out there to help us really understand where reporting obligations actually come from. And then I'll jump into the main part of the presentation. So that is, first, we're going to talk about the obligations for reporting safety information to the IRB. And then we'll jump to the next main topic, which is obligations for reporting what I call non-safety information to the IRB. And finally, I'll wrap all of that up with key takeaways. So let's get started. First, the role of the IRB. Now, I think we all know really the IRB's role in both initial review of research and in continuing review of research is to really protect the right safety and welfare of research subjects. Now, how the IRB is able to do this, especially in the continuing review context, is by receiving information from sponsors, the CROs, and the sites, information that really helps the IRB understand what additional steps it may have to take to protect those subjects in research. So it seems simple enough. The IRB receives information from sites, sponsors, CROs, digests that information, and takes those additional steps. Well, if it were that easy, then it would not be one of the #1 questions I get if I'm at a site or if I'm answering a question, what actually has to be reported to the IRB? And here's just a very simple diagram to illustrate why it's such an easy concept. Well, not exactly. As we can all see here, there's a lot going on. So if you look in that bottom right corner of this diagram, you have the PI, you have the site. They're conducting the research, there's adverse events that are happening, there could be anticipated problems that are occurring. And the PI is reporting these adverse events or these anticipated problems to the sponsor or CRO, and the sponsor or CRO may be digesting this information and determining it's an anticipated problem or something of that nature that has to be reported to the IRB. Of course, it's not always like that. The PI, where the research is being conducted, could also be reporting information directly to the IRB. Then, of course, there's all sorts of other reporting obligations, and this diagram doesn't even begin to capture all of the reporting. Then we have the IRB at the very top. So, of course, the IRB, once it receives information from the sponsor or CRO or site, it may have to take additional steps itself. For example, it may determine that something is an anticipated problem or there's serious or continuing noncompliance, and it itself may have to report to the institution on the far left side or the FDA on the other far side or the Department of Health and Human Services. So there's a lot going on here. But what I really want to focus on and what this presentation is about is reporting obligations to the IRB. So it's those gray lines that go directly to the IRB. So let's keep it focused today and really understand what those obligations are. So again, you can have at the site, you have the PI, that box on the bottom right side. You have the site, they're conducting research. Something happens, it's an adverse event, or there's some other problem that occurs. Of course, the PI can report directly to the IRB, or the PI may be feeding that information to the sponsor who assesses that information and determines whether or not it has to be reported to the IRB. So really that's where we're focused today, are those two main gray arrows. So with that, we saw a lot of arrows going everywhere, a lot of different terminology. Of course there are problems with reporting, and that's why we're having this presentation today. Two of the main problems, the first one is unnecessary reporting. The IRB does end up getting a lot of information that does not have to actually be reported to it. And the problem with this is when the IRB gets inundated with all sorts of information that doesn't actually meet any sort of reporting criteria, then there's thousands of documents that the IRB has to sift through to really determine if there's anything that the IRB has to take action on to protect the right safety and welfare of those human research subjects. And again, this isn't just a problem that we see at Quorum and have noticed. It's a problem that the FTI has definitely recognized. That's why this quote up on your screen is actually this problem discussed by the FDA. So that's the first problem, is unnecessary reporting. The next problem is with this sort of unnecessary reporting and all the information the IRB may receive, there also may be no explanation provided with the information that is reported. When there's no information provided to the IRB, so let's say the IRB just receives 1,000 adverse events, there's really no way for the IRB to assess, okay, out of these 1,000 adverse events, did the sponsor, do the sites think any of this actually qualifies as an unanticipated problem that has to actually be reported to the IRB. So it's tough without any background information to what's being reported to the IRB. Again, this is a concern that was highlighted by the FDA. So there's two problems. We have unnecessary reporting, and we also have reporting where there's no explanation provided. So with that said, to address those two problems and to really understand today what to report to the IRB, let's first look at the regulatory landscape and understand where the reporting obligations to the IRB actually come from and what actually has to be reported to the IRB. So today, this presentation is going to really focus on the Department of Health and Human Services regulation. I think we're all very familiar with that, otherwise known as the Common Rule. That's the 45 CFR 46. And then, of course, we have those FDA regulations, 21 CFR 56 governing IRBs. We have 21 CFR 312 talking about INDs focused on drugs there. We have 21 CFR 320 talking about bioavailability and bioequivalence requirements. And 21 CFR 812 investigational device exemption. So again, of course, there's other regulations besides that, but really when I'm talking about the information today, it's really focused on these regulations. The other thing that this presentation focuses on that is really, really helpful when thinking about what to report to the IRB are guidance documents produced by Health and Human Services and the Food and Drug Administration. So here, I'm going to be referencing a lot a guidance document from basically OHARP, Guidance on Reviewing and Reporting Unanticipated Problems Involving Risk to Subjects or Others. There's the FDA guidance for clinical investigators, sponsors, and IRBs on reporting adverse events. And finally, we have the newest guidance, which is for industry and investigators, safety reporting requirements for INDs and BA and BE studies. So this is really where you can see I've taken my information in this presentation. And the reason why I'd like you to know exactly where this information is coming from is because it empowers you, if you do ever have questions, you can go to these regulations or you can go to this guidance and really understand the reporting obligations. So within those regulations and within that guidances, where is the obligation to actually report information to the IRB, report that safety information to the IRB? Well, I have the citations up there. It's generally known that the IRB has to receive certain information, especially safety information, in order, again, to ensure the safety, rights, and welfare of subjects. So we know the IRB has to receive certain information in order to do its job. But what information is that? That information is what we really call unanticipated problem information. So information that would be considered an unanticipated problem, whether that's an adverse event or whether that's something that's not medically related, such as a problem at a site, for example, theft of a laptop that has participant data on it. So what we know from the regulations is that we have the term unanticipated problem, and this is actually that information, that only information that has to be reported to the IRB in terms of what we're talking about for today's presentation. Again, because it's actually not so clear, the term unanticipated problem, but let me point out where it actually exists in the regulations and sort of in the context in which it's presented. So we know we have to report unanticipated problems to the IRB. Well, it's found in 21 CFR 312. It says there, the investigator shall promptly report to the IRB all unanticipated problems involving risk to human subjects or others. We also see this term in the context of the IRB in understanding that the IRB must have procedures for handling these unanticipated problems that are reported to the IRB. So again, this is really the focus there. That's where we know IRBs have to receive unanticipated problem information. While it's nice that this term's in the regulations, what's not so nice, it's not actually defined in the regulations, but we do get some help from guidance documents. So the most important guidance document in really understanding and defining what an unanticipated problem is from the Office of Human Research Protections, or it's the Department of Health and Human Services guidance. And from that guidance, we know that an unanticipated problem that must be reported to the IRB is any incident, experience, or outcome that meets all three of the following criteria. So, only if it meets all three criteria must you report to the IRB. So the first criteria is it must be unexpected. This can be in terms of the event, for example, not being in the consent form or just not being in the investigator's brochure, something that's just really unexpected, and that can be in that it wasn't even on our radar that this could happen, or it could be something that we knew may happen in terms of a risk, but it starts to happen more frequently than expected. So the first criteria is it must be unexpected. The second criteria is the incident, experience, or outcome must be related or possibly related to a subject's participation in the research. And finally, the incident, experience, or outcome must suggest that the research places subjects or others at a greater risk of harm than was previously known or recognized. So it's going to be key there. It's not just that a person was actually harmed, but that they could have been harmed. So again, those three criteria are very important because it's only that information that meets those three criteria. It's only then when it's considered an unanticipated problem and must be reported to the IRB. So again, we have unexpected, related or possibly related, and places subjects or others at a greater risk of harm. In addition to defining unanticipated problem, that guidance also tells us something else. That HHS guidance tells us that there may be those unanticipated problems out there that are related to adverse events, so related to basically medical occurrences. And there are those unanticipated problems that are not related to adverse events. So this is what I deem as those unanticipated problems that are not safety related. So there we see how this presentation is organized today. We know that you must report unanticipated problems to the IRB, and you know that those unanticipated problems may be related to an adverse event, so therefore safety related, or those unanticipated problems may not be related to an adverse event, and therefore are unanticipated problems that are non-safety related. And I'm going to talk about both those different things. To highlight this concept that there are these unanticipated problems that can be related to adverse events or that are not related to adverse events, we have this Venn diagram provided by the Department of Health and Human Services. So that far left side, that A piece to the Venn diagram, we have those adverse events that are not unanticipated problems. So we're not necessarily talking about these today. There's a lot of side effects that happen in research, but again, if they don't actually meet all three criteria of unanticipated problem, they do not have to be reported to the IRB. What we're really focused on is that B piece, which are those adverse events that are actually anticipated problems. So that would be a side effect that happens that wasn't known previously. It wasn't in the consent form, wasn't in the investigator's brochure. And we also have that category C on that far right side. So here we have our unanticipated problems that are not related to safety information. So again, an example could be theft of a laptop at a site that has participant data. It would be an unanticipated problem, but it's not related to a medical occurrence. So with that, let's start off by talking about reporting to the IRB that safety information, so that B part of the Venn diagram. So here, again, we're talking about reporting now to the IRB that's safety-related information. This focuses on that left side of the Venn diagram, and like I already explained, in the middle, that part B are going to be those adverse events that do qualify as unanticipated problems and therefore must be reported to the IRB. So let's really dive into what that actually means, what safety information has to be reported to the IRB. So to do that, of course, we've already gone over the term unanticipated problem. We know that there, if something is unanticipated, if it's unexpected, related or possibly related to the research, or places subjects or others at a greater risk of harm. We know that definition. That definition, however, is not too specific for our purposes. So what I actually want to do to help us determine what safety information actually has to be reported to the IRB is I want to use two other terms. One term I call SUSAR. That's serious and unexpected suspected adverse reactions. That's for drugs. The other term is UADE. unanticipated adverse device effect. I'm going to use these two terms because what I want you to know is that if something is a UADE or if something is an SUSAR, then by its very nature, by the criteria it meets there, it is an unanticipated problem that must be reported to the IRB. So know that we're still talking about reporting to the IRB and related to the unanticipated problem, but again, we're going to focus on those two terms because they help us really understand what safety information actually has to be reported to the IRB. So let's look at that first term, SUSAR. A SUSAR, again, must be reported to the IRB because it inherently is an unanticipated problem, and the criteria for a SUSAR is 1, serious. This seems simple enough. Something is serious. I think people have a general idea of what is serious. So this could be death, an event that's life-threatening, inpatient hospitalization, or prolongation of existing hospitalization. There's, of course, other things that could mean serious too, listed there. I don't need to list them all off. I think we have a general idea of what is actually serious. The second criteria is unexpected. I also think this is pretty clear to understand. So an event that happens is unexpected if it's, for example, a side effect that's not listed in the investigator's brochure, it's not in the consent form, or it's not in the protocol. So really it was not expected that this event, the side effect, should happen to participants. So again, we have serious, we have unexpected. I think those are quite clear. Where it starts to get a bit more murky is in that third criteria, otherwise known as suspected adverse reaction. Here's where we really have to start to analyze what actually is a suspected adverse reaction, and therefore what actually is a SUSAR that must be reported to the IRB. And a suspected adverse reaction is where there is a reasonable possibility that the drug caused the adverse event. In other words, there's actually evidence to suggest a causal relationship between the drug and the event. This is such an incredibly important point because it's this point that the FDA was really getting at in saying that the IRBs are being inundated with information that actually should not be reported to them. For example, they're receiving thousands of adverse events that aren't really adverse events. It's just related to disease progression in, for example, an elderly population. So because I really think that's the term that throws people off, I want to focus on what actually is a suspected adverse reaction. So suspected adverse reaction. It's where there's a reasonable possibility that the drug caused the adverse event. What the FDA has done to try to help us understand this term is it's also provided examples of what it considers a suspected adverse reaction. The first class of examples that it provides is what the FDA calls individual occurrences. The FDA explains that these are a single occurrence of an event that is uncommon and known to be strongly associated with drug exposure. So some examples would be angioedema, hepatic injury, and Stevens-Johnson syndrome. So because if a participant experiences one of these injuries, you know that there's such a strong relation between this injury and drug exposure, you know there's likely a reasonable possibility that the drug actually caused the adverse event. Therefore, it is a suspected adverse reaction, and if it is unexpected and serious, of course, it must be reported to the IRB. So let's test our knowledge. Let's make sure we really understand the concept of this individual occurrence. So I'm actually going to turn now out to all of you listening in today and ask you a question and ask for your participation. So in my example, I say, in a phase 2 study testing an investigational drug for hepatitis C, a subject experiences hepatic injury. In addition to the investigational drug, the subject was continuing her standard hepatitis C therapy at the time of hepatic injury. Taking this into account, do we think this is an individual occurrence that is a suspected adverse reaction? I'm going to give the audience about 30 seconds to provide your feedback. Okay, it looks like our answers are in. Thanks for everyone's participation. Looks like 60% of you said yes, this is an individual occurrence that would be classified as a suspected adverse reaction, and about 40% of you said no. I like this breakdown, and the reason why I like this breakdown is I really do think this can be debatable, and that was the intent of this question. But my answer is going to be yes in this instance, and let me tell you why. Although the injury could have been caused by the subject's standard therapy or through disease progression, hepatic injury is strongly associated with drug exposure. Since this is the case, even with these other confounding factors, there's a reasonable possibility that the drug caused the adverse event. Again, I know this is a little bit debatable, but that's my rationale for saying why this individual occurrence could be a suspected adverse reaction. Now, the next category that the FDA provides is the category called one or more occurrences. So what the FDA explains this means is one or more occurrences of an event that is not commonly associated with drug exposure, but is otherwise uncommon in the population exposed to the drug. An example here would be tendon rupture. So let's test our knowledge about one or more occurrences and whether or not one or more occurrences would be considered a suspected adverse reaction. Again, I'm going to turn this back out to the audience. My example is a subject with extrapulmonary small cell carcinoma receiving an investigational chemotherapy agent experiences a bowel perforation during his second cycle of chemotherapy. Is this one occurrence a suspected adverse reaction? Again, I'll give you about 30 seconds to answer this question. Okay, looks like we have our poll closed and our answers are in. So here we have about 59% of the people saying yes, this is a suspected adverse reaction. And the other percentages saying no, this is not a suspected adverse reaction. My answer this time is going to be no. And again, let me explain, because the questions that I wrote are meant to introduce kind of that gray area. Again, this is the reason why one of the #1 questions we get is what actually has to be reported to the IRB and why we're even discussing this topic today. So my rationale for my answer about why this one occurrence is not a suspected adverse reaction is the following. Bowel perforation is not commonly associated with drug exposure, so that's key, and bowel perforation is seen in cancer patients. Therefore, while there is some literature on chemotherapy-induced bowel perforation, this one event is not reportable. However, if there were more than just this one occurrence of bowel perforation, then I would say reconsideration should be given as to whether to report the events as more than one occurrence. So the difference between this one and the last example there was that a strong association between the event that happened and drug exposure. This one, not quite so much. And the final category that the FDA provides to help us understand what is actually a suspected adverse reaction is what the FDA calls aggregate analysis of specific events. This is an aggregate analysis of specific events observed in a clinical trial that indicates those events occur more frequently in the drug treatment group than in a concurrent or historical control group. So this aggregate analysis is really, really important because in terms of the FDA's guidance and the Department of Health and Human Services guidance on what actually has to be reported to the IRB, one of their #1 things that they point out is that just one event is reported and that may not signal a reasonable possibility that the drug caused the adverse event. What the FDA really is trying to get everyone to do is do this aggregate analysis, look at various events in the totality to give a better sense of whether or not there is actually a reasonable possibility that the event that's occurring is related to the study product. So let's test our knowledge about this category. My example is 17 oncology sites are participating in a research study comparing an investigational chemotherapy agent to standard therapy in subjects ages 60 to 85. Of those subjects receiving the investigational drug, an average of 35% of subjects across the 17 sites experienced deep vein thrombosis. Does this aggregate analysis indicate a suspected adverse reaction? I'll give you about 30 seconds. Okay, it looks like our polls are closed and our answers are in. We have 88% of the population saying yes, and we have 12% saying no. So here I'm going to agree with the majority this time, and I'm going to say yes, I do think, based on this aggregate analysis, that the deep vein thrombosis would be a suspected adverse reaction, and here's my rationale for that. While deep vein thrombosis is common in cancer patients, 35% of the subjects receiving the investigational drug experience deep vein thrombosis. While this may be related to each subject's cancer, in aggregate, 35% could indicate that there is a reasonable possibility that the investigational drug is causing the event. So that's why I say yes to this example. So again, it's really critical to understand the concept of suspected adverse reaction. It's important to understand what the three criteria are, which are serious, unexpected, and suspected adverse reaction. So it's important to know that, and it's important also to feed into that definition those examples that the FDA provides of individual occurrence, one or more occurrences, and aggregate analysis. If we really understand suspected adverse reaction and understand serious unexpected, so that whole SUSAR term, this helps us avoid what the FDA explains are significant problems in terms of reporting, and especially reporting information to the IRB. So some examples that the FDA says, if you really don't understand what a SUSAR is and if you don't understand what a suspected adverse reaction is, there may be those serious adverse experiences reported that are unlikely to have been manifestations of the underlying disease, so mortality or major morbidity. You also may have reported those serious adverse experiences that commonly occurred in the study population independent of drug exposure. So there could be strokes or acute myocardial infarction in an elderly population. Again, may not actually meet the criteria of a SUSAR, serious unexpected, but again, that key piece, suspected adverse reaction. And finally, the FDA says if you don't really understand that term, you may end up reporting serious adverse experiences that were study endpoints. So as an example, the study was evaluating whether the drug reduced the rate of these events. If you don't understand this term and really don't understand that difficult piece of suspected adverse reaction, again, the IRB ends up receiving all sorts of information that's really just a drain on resources in terms of the people reporting to the IRB and in terms of the IRB receiving this information, which really isn't beneficial because these things don't necessarily mean they're a SUSAR, in other words, an unanticipated problem that the IRB should be taking action on. So that was the term SUSAR. Again, if something is inherently a SUSAR, it is an unanticipated problem that must be reported to the IRB. So a SUSAR is a term associated with drugs. Now I'm going to talk about the term associated with devices. So that term is UADE, or unanticipated adverse device effect. If something is a UADE, by its very nature, it is an unanticipated problem that must be reported to the IRB. So what are actually the criteria for a UADE? The first criteria, serious. Just like with SUSAR, first criteria is serious. Again, this could be death, life-threatening, or a serious problem. I think we all have a general grasp about what means serious. The second criteria is not previously identified. So also very similar to SUSAR in terms of the unexpected criteria. So not previously identified could be an effect not previously identified in its nature, severity, or degree of incidence in the investigational plan, so in the device manual or in the protocol or somewhere else. And the final criteria of a UADE is caused by or associated with a device. Here, this really links up with the term for SUSAR, suspected adverse reaction. So really, it's written differently. It's tailored towards devices, but it's generally that same criteria that we see in a SUSAR is for a UADE. And it's not just me saying this. The FDA also, if you look at its guidance that it produced for clinical investigator sponsors and IRBs in terms of adverse event reporting to IRBs, it even comes out and says that you should be reporting UADEs to the IRB just like you should be reporting SUSARs to the IRB. So essentially, UADEs and SUSARs should be treated the same. Again, we know they have slightly different terminology, but they should be handled the same in terms of really analyzing, is it serious, is it unexpected, and is it related to the device. Only if all three criteria met should you be reporting this to the IRB. The other thing to take into account, since the FDA did equate a UADE to a SUSAR in that guidance, is think about those examples that the FDA provided. So again, that example of an individual occurrence in a device trial, or one or more occurrences in a device trial, or if there are multiple occurrences determined through an aggregate analysis. So those are still beneficial categories for us to really think through whether or not an event that happens in a trial is actually related to the device. Now, in terms of recommended practices for reporting safety information, so we know that you have to report to the IRB unanticipated problems, and that we know for drug studies and device studies we have those specific terms, SUSAR and UADE, that by their very nature are unanticipated problems and must be reported to the IRB. So what's the best way to actually report to the IRB? So the FDA provides some real nice guidance here actually in terms of how to report. And what it suggests for multi-center studies is that while the investigator really understands the causality piece, the investigator's right there, they're the one assessing the patient and the actual adverse event that occurred, again, it's going to be so important in a multi-center trial to really analyze more than just one occurrence, to kind of do that aggregate analysis of data and adverse events from multiple sites to really determine if there is a reasonable possibility that the drug or device actually caused the event. So what the FDA suggests for multi-center trials is there can be an arrangement between the sites and the CRO or sponsor in terms of who actually reports that safety information to the IRB, who actually reports those unanticipated problems to the IRB. So because the FDA recommends this, of course, we as the IRB think this is a good idea. Of course, it doesn't always have to be the case. Of course, investigators can always report directly to the IRB, but generally, like the FDA says, the sponsor is in a better position to process and analyze the significance of AE information for multiple sites. And you can go ahead and have this arrangement where the site submits to the sponsor, and the sponsor is the one that determines what to submit to the IRB, as long as this arrangement is made explicit between the various components, so the sponsor, CRO, the site, and the IRB. Once that arrangement is in place, then you understand who's going to report that information to the IRB. If you need help in terms of this arrangement, you can always work with the IRB. The IRB is there as a resource and can help understand and kind of navigate what actually should be reported to it and who's going to be doing that, what contact from the CRO, what contact from the sponsor, or if it truly is going to be a site. So again, don't forget to use the IRB as a resource. That's one tip. The other thing I really wanted to point out is because after going through this presentation so far, we know there's only certain things that have to be reported to the IRB. Those are unanticipated problems that could be a SUSAR or a UADE, but know this, if the protocol states blanketly that all adverse events have to be reported to the IRB, this is very problematic because then we can't engage and only report what is necessary because you have to follow the protocol. So there's sort of a warning in the protocol, be sure that there's not a general statement about reporting all adverse events, because if there is, then of course everyone's going to be obligated to report all information, which is going to do away with our whole point of analyzing what actually has to be reported to the IRB. So make sure in the protocol it doesn't have that blanket statement. Now that was for multi-center trials. Of course, if there's a single-center trial or investigator-initiated study, of course it's the investigator that's likely going to be the one reporting to the IRB. This still means that the investigator can arrange with the IRB in what actual format to report to the IRB. And I still have my same tips here. In the protocol, it should not state that all adverse events are going to report to the IRB. Again, it's only those adverse events that are a SUSAR or UADE, and therefore by their very nature are unanticipated problem that must be reported to the IRB. So I caution you there on the protocol. Now what about timing? So we know that the sponsor can report or the site can report, but what the FDA has recommended for those multi-center trials is really the sponsor or CRO should be analyzing and determining what to report to the IRB. In terms of when to report, we have to report to the IRB promptly. That is the term used, promptly. Well, promptly is only really defined in guidance documents. And promptly, from the FDA's vantage, is generally considered 10 business days, which is, again, supported by the FDA's guidance. So 10 business days. And this is 10 business days from when the investigator may learn of the event. Again, this may become tricky in an aggregate analysis because in an aggregate analysis, you really don't know that something may be reportable to the IRB until after all the events are analyzed. So again, have to understand there that 10 business days may apply to determining that something is an adverse event after conducting that aggregate analysis. And the other thing to caution you here is this 10-day time frame exists whether or not the investigator is going to report to the IRB or whether or not the sponsor is going to report to the IRB. That 10-day time frame exists generally from when the event is discovered, again with the caveat about the whole aggregate analysis piece. Finally, if there are any questions about what to report in terms of safety reporting to the IRB, so again, unanticipated problems, that could be the SUSAR or that UADE, talk to the IRB. The IRB is the one you're reporting to. The IRB should be able to inform you what to report, whether to report, how to report, and when to report. Okay, we're done talking about reporting that safety information to the IRB. Now I want to switch gears and I want to talk about obligations to reporting non-safety information to the IRB. So now, going back to that Venn diagram we've seen twice, I'm in that far column, that C column, unanticipated problems that are not adverse events. So here we're talking about unanticipated problems that are not actually related to a medical occurrence. So we're not talking about that typical injury from a side effect or something like that. Here we're talking about what's usually a problem at a site. So again, I've used this example before, but the theft of a laptop that has participant information on it. This could be an unanticipated problem that has to be reported to the IRB, but it's not necessarily an adverse event. So let's figure out what actually to report for non-safety information to the IRB. Here we have that same term that we had for safety information. We have unanticipated problem, but this time we're not going to get into the SUSAR or the UADE. We're just sticking with the term unanticipated problem. And again, to reiterate the three criteria of an unanticipated problem, it is unexpected, related or possibly related to the research, and places subject or others at a greater risk of harm than was previously known or recognized. If all three criteria met, you must report to the IRB. Let's look at some examples of unanticipated problems. An example could be failure to obtain informed consent. At Quorum, we require that major protocol deviations are reported to the IRB. So this could be if there's a violation of the inclusion-exclusion criteria, or if a study procedure was omitted. Things of that nature could rise to the level of an unanticipated problem. There could be study personnel misconduct that adversely impacts the study. There could be adverse findings by a regulatory agency, medical board, or other relevant body. So for example, let's say you have a PI at a site. The PI, you find out that the medical license has been suspended for some harming one of their patients or something of that nature. Well, the IRB should know about this because this could very well be an unanticipated problem. It's unexpected, it could be serious, and by the nature of the participant being with that investigator, they could be placed at a greater risk of harm than was previously known or recognized. The key thing to remember in terms of figuring out what actually is an unanticipated problem that must be reported to the IRB, you really have to understand the circumstances and the specific factors surrounding the unanticipated problem. So again, it's not always cut and dry about what is an unanticipated problem, but understand those three criteria that will really help guide you on what actually should be reported to the IRB. Now, to help us understand the term unanticipated problem in the context of reporting this non-safety information to the IRB, let's go through a few examples. The first example, I'm going to turn this out to the audience, is an investigator is conducting behavioral research and collects individually identifiable sensitive information about illicit drug use by surveying college students. The data is stored on a laptop computer that is password protected. The laptop is stolen from the investigator's car. My question to all of you is this reportable to the IRB as an unanticipated problem? I'll give you about 30 seconds to answer that question. Okay, we've closed the polls. The answers are in. We have a resounding 91% of you answering yes and 9% answering no. I'm going to agree with the majority here and say yes, this is an unanticipated problem. So a laptop stolen has identifiable data. If this gets into the wrong hands, this could definitely be place subjects at a greater risk of harm than was previously known or recognized. It is related to their participation in the research, and it's certainly unexpected that a laptop would be stolen. Now, the laptop is password protected, but again, it can be very easy to overcome this. For example, on some laptops, you can just remove the hard drive, place it back in the laptop, and that does away with the password protection. So there's still the chance that a participant could be placed at a greater risk of harm. So I would say yes, this is an unanticipated problem that must be reported to the IRB. Our next example. An investigator is conducting a psychology study evaluating decision-making and response times when persons are listening to music at various decibel levels. In order to perform the study, participants are placed in a small, windowless, soundproof booth. The IRB-approved protocol and consent form describe claustrophobic reactions as one of the research risks. The 12th subject enrolled in the research experiences a significant claustrophobia, resulting in the subject withdrawing from the study. Is this reportable to the IRB as an unanticipated problem? 30 seconds. Okay, the polls are closed. The answers are in. We have 88% answering no, this is not an unanticipated problem. And we have 12% answering yes, this is an unanticipated problem. I'm going to say no, this is not an unanticipated problem. While experiencing claustrophobia could be serious, being in the study may have placed this participant at a greater risk of harm. This person probably wouldn't have experienced claustrophobia but for being in this study. But the key here is it's not unexpected. So claustrophobia was actually listed as a risk in the research. So because it was listed, it was expected, and therefore it does not meet one of those critical criteria for actually calling something an unanticipated problem. So no, I would not say this is an unanticipated problem. And our final example today. As a result of a processing error by a pharmacy technician, a subject enrolled in a multi-center clinical trial receives a dose of an experimental agent that is 10 times higher than the dose dictated by the IRB-approved protocol. While the dosing error increased the risk of toxic manifestations of the experimental agent, the subject experienced no detectable harm or adverse effect after an appropriate period of careful observation. Is this reportable to the IRB as an unanticipated problem? I'll give you 30 seconds for this final question. Okay, we have 93% of you answering yes, this is an unanticipated problem, and 7% answering no, this is not. My answer is yes, this is an unanticipated problem. Again, the three criteria: unexpected. This is definitely unexpected. You wouldn't expect that the dose was given at 10 times higher. Is it serious? Yes, it is serious in terms of what could happen, and that's really the key. Because while the person wasn't actually harmed, it placed the subject at a greater risk of harm than was previously known or recognized. So that's sort of the key part that I think the 7% of you might have got mixed up on, is that while the person wasn't actually harmed, they very well could have, and that is sort of the key. So we have our unexpected, we know it's related to the research, and the subject was placed at a greater risk of harm. So my answer is yes there. Okay, now in terms of recommended practices for reporting unanticipated problems to the IRB, again, for multi-center or single center. I'm going to combine these two here because when we're talking about reporting unanticipated problems that are not safety related, so we're not talking about the SUSAR, we're not talking about the UADE, we're talking about non-safety related information, generally these occurrences happen at a site. So because it happens at a site, we typically expect that the site is going to be the one reporting the unanticipated problem to the IRB as opposed to the site providing the information to the sponsor or CRO who's then going to provide it to the IRB. Not to say that arrangement can't happen, it's that it's going to be most common. We probably recommend that the site just report directly to the IRB. Again, the investigator can arrange in terms of what format to report to the IRB. For example, Quorum has an unanticipated problem form in which to report certain occurrences to Quorum. Timing for unanticipated problems reporting to the IRB. Here, again, the term promptly. And promptly, in looking at the FDA's guidance, it's generally considered 10 business days from when the event is discovered. So here we would certainly hope that at a site, if there's an unanticipated problem, again, theft of a laptop, informed consent was missed, and someone was enrolled that didn't meet the inclusion-exclusion criteria, and that placed them at a greater risk of harm, we would expect that to be reported within 10 business days. And again, the arrangement for unanticipated problems is typically going to come from the site, but if there is an arrangement with the sponsor or CRO, understand that that 10-day time frame exists, starts when the event is discovered. So no matter the arrangement, it's a 10 business day time frame. If there are any questions whatsoever about reporting unanticipated problems to the IRB, again, remember, contact the IRB. They're the one that should have the policies and procedures about what should be reported to them. So if you have questions about what to report, whether to report, how to report, when to report, contact the IRB. They're there as a resource. Now let's wrap up with the key takeaways from today. First, know where the obligations to report to the IRB originate. I gave you those regulations and the guidance documents at first, but really understand that you know what to report to the IRB because of that term unanticipated problem. And that term unanticipated problem, it's 3 criteria: unexpected, related, and places subjects at a greater risk of harm than was previously known or recognized. So know that that's really what makes up what is you're obligated to report to the IRB. In terms of drugs or devices, understand the terms SUSAR and UADE and know their criteria. Because if you know their criteria, inherently these are unanticipated problems that require reporting to the IRB. Finally, understand that there are unanticipated problems that are not safety related. So those that are not related to a medical occurrence, but these also may be reported to the IRB if they meet all 3 criteria of an unanticipated problem. And in terms of reporting these unanticipated problems related to safety information or non-safety information, know the time frame and know how to report to your IRB. The IRB is there as a resource, so contact them and use them. Quorum is here. Quorum is available with its regulatory staff and its site and sponsor and CRO administration to handle any questions you have about reporting to Quorum. With that, I appreciate your time very much, and I'm going to pass you back over to Ari for some few wrap-up comments.
Thank you, Mitchell, for preparing and presenting the information on this very current topic. We'd like to let our viewers know that if you have additional questions and didn't use the chat box during the webinar, you'll have another opportunity to submit those questions via the survey at the end of the webinar. So once the webinar ends, just don't close your browser down. The survey will pop up. Alternatively, Mitchell has made his email available for questions, or you can email your questions to clientrelations@quorumreview.com. We'll do our best to follow up individually or through a posted FAQ and answer your questions within 30 days. And then the webinar recording, slide deck, certificate of attendance, and special resource documents will be posted within 5 business days. We'll email you a link to view these items as they become available. We do value your opinion, so I'm going to remind you once again to take this survey at the end of the webinar and provide us with this feedback. And then once again, we here at Quorum Review would like to thank you for attending our webinar. We hope you found this topic informative and useful. If you're interested in learning more about Quorum, please do visit us at www.quorumreview.com. You can also find us on the following social media outlets: Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And on behalf of everyone here at Quorum, we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.